Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. When a natural disaster or some type of major event happens, often it leaves people that are living in the community, first responders, with some mental stress that is often hard to deal with. It's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Charles Nelson, who's a clinical psychologist that specializes in PTSD. So stay tuned in order to learn about some of the symptoms, some of the triggers, but also some of the valuable resources that are out there to help first responders and others deal with this. Hi, Dr. Nelson. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thanks for inviting me, Leanne, for this chat.
Well, it's great that you could take the time to talk to us today. So before we get started, can you just explain a little bit about your background and what got you to here today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist and I work in London, Ontario. And I've been working for a very long time now with folks who develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Probably 15 to 20 years. I've done applied clinical work, treatment, assessment, recovery work, but additionally, I've done a great deal of research in this area. So now what we've done is we've expanded into a private clinic. We have 4 other clinicians, another psychologist, 2 masters in social worker, and another doctoral student from the Western Clinical Program that we're working an awful lot with the main providers in London, Ontario, which is WSIB, Veterans Affairs Canada, and then local and regional police services.
That's great. So that you mentioned PTSD, and that's exactly the topic I wanted to discuss in this video. So for someone who might not know, first of all, what it stands for, what the acronym is, but even can you just explain what it is and some of the symptoms that someone might have if they do have PTSD?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, it's often very much misconstrued by the public as something that people experience in life and then kind of, with very little interference in their life, get back on course. And what we've realized probably in the last 4 or 5 decades, earnestly through research, is that post-traumatic stress disorder is a medical condition like any other. And it develops with known context of traumatic adversity that starts to affect people in very subtle and not so subtle ways. And we refer to the symptoms that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder as a constellation of features. So if you use the analogy of looking into a night sky and you see a few of the features that make up the Big Dipper, there are, if you take a couple of the stars that make up the stem of the spoon and then the bowl of the spoon, you need all of those things to call it the Little Dipper. And in post-traumatic stress disorder, we need certain features to be present for a majority of the time that people are suffering in terms of symptoms for a prolonged amount of time, that they in fact meet the constellation, which is the syndrome, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And some of those symptoms that people tend to demonstrate when they've experienced an extreme life-altering traumatic adversity are things such as alterations in cognition and mood, where we think differently. It takes way more effort to have basic concentration. It takes considerable effort to pull yourself away from dysphoric or depressing thoughts, to dwell excessively or ruminate on content that might be anxiety-provoking. It also involves those classical symptoms of PTSD, which are hypervigilance and re-experiencing, which can come in the form of flashbacks or often accompany our sleep or dream content, that the theme or main thrust of the adversity that we experienced replays itself over in certain circumstances that makes it very, very difficult for us to be in our day-to-day activities and focus on everyday regular roles we have at home, with our kids, in our communities, and at work.
So I know when it comes to natural disasters, I think that, me personally, I can think of situations where I've been talking to people. One in particular, there was a woman who, her house almost burnt down in a fire in High Level, I think Alberta, in I think it was 2013. And then as the fires, and she thought she was okay, her house wasn't burnt, but then she said this past summer in 2019, when the fires were there again, she said, I had to move. I realized my kids weren't sleeping, I wasn't sleeping. She said it was horrible. And, so it's situations like that. And I guess in your line of business, you would call them trigger events or things like that. So I'm just curious, for someone who has been through a traumatic situation, they may think they're okay, but how do they know, or what can they do to help prepare themselves for something that could be a trigger event in the near future?
Yeah, so lots of good, important themes that you're bringing to the forefront right now, Leanne, and that is, how do we know we're okay if we have a natural disaster, or kind of a one that crosses both natural and man-made and human dimensions, which is like a house fire or a motor vehicle collision. We might feel okay. And in the short term, it's actually very normal and probably adaptive that our basic beliefs on safety, conformity, things that we take for granted as occurring in a pretty seamless way, such as getting up every morning, having breakfast, setting out for work, that if that is jeopardized by displacement from our home, whether it's natural climatic changes, hurricanes, other very extreme weather conditions, if we get displaced from our home, it really jeopardizes our belief in a sanctuary and being safe on a day-to-day basis. And if we are fortunate enough that we have a house fire or a major disruption in our lifestyle, but we're able to have the support, the affiliative family support by other people who can support us in that time, that may moderate or offset some of the displacement and feelings of being out of our own element a little bit better. You also mentioned a really important artifact or side effect of traumatic adversity, and that is, often we can have a really scary, frightening, life-altering event, go back to our routine, and feel somewhat anxious but adaptive. And then later on, there might be some, as you called it, a trigger or an activating event that makes for a resurgence of those symptoms. And in those cases, which is really quite common, in fact, it's actually your nervous system, your biological central nervous system, your brain, that's saying, you know what, Leanne, we thought we were safe. And then everything changed, and our worldview has changed now. So we're not sure we believe we're safe all the time anymore. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a lot of symptoms, anxiety, re-experiencing either numbness or hyperreactivity to symptoms around us, as a way to challenge us that we're in fact safe. And I don't know if you personally have ever been involved in a motor vehicle collision, but simply, even if you're involved in a fender bender and you've driven that route thousands of times before, what your nervous system is going to do in a rather adaptive way is say, you know what, we got hit from behind and we didn't expect that to happen today. So every time you get behind the wheel, we're going to make you very symptomatic. We're going to have you look in that rearview mirror often. We're going to have you check and recheck your surroundings in an almost involuntary way, because we want to make sure we're safe going forward. So in the short term, those symptoms, those re-experiencing phenomenon, are very adaptive. House fires are bad. People die. People get seriously injured. We lose our sanctuary. So anything that is similar to that going forward, it's going to get our attention. So in recovery from these types of adversive events, we provide that context. We look at someone over the broader lifespan of their strivings, that if they've been displaced, if they've been affected by something that's very scary or that goes against our social conventional beliefs of law, safety, security, regularity, that if that gets breached, if that gets challenged, that we look at the specific unique factors that went into that, so that the person gets better at getting that context rather than overgeneralizing.
Yeah.
If you and I go to Hawaii and a volcano erupts and the flights are grounded and we feel unsafe and it's very otherworldly to see all this ash in the air, our brains are going to say, Hawaii, danger, don't go there, right? Even though the vast majority of time that people yearn to go to Hawaii, it's not known or remembered for a very, potential for catastrophic, cataclysmic world events. It's more of a beautiful destination. We do the same sort of work in trauma recovery with post-traumatic stress disorder, that people feel very empowered to look at the stories of their traumatic experience with a degree of distance, with a degree of objectivity, almost like a scientist looking at the data, than someone who's reacting to all the emotional factors that go with it. So to make a long story short, in the short term, a lot of these symptoms are actually adaptive. They signal to us in no uncertain terms there are very real dangers in the world around us, but that overgeneralized, that fear circuit in our brain that gets kind of jammed on, that engenders those symptoms, we can actually, through a lot of care and a lot of reflection, we can actually make sure that we're being fair with ourselves, that the thoughts and emotions that correspond to the traumatic adversity are actually set in their own context at one place in time, and that enables us to get back to our functional roles, get back to the totalitarity of our life that makes us feel fulfilled in a meaningful way.
That's great. I mean, for individuals, I think that's really important that, we take the time to reflect on those things and process them. I guess too, I wanted to touch base on the first responder piece, because I think, I go in on the recovery side. I don't see that immediate response. Those first responders that go in, I think, have to be special people to be able to see the things that they see, and not take that with them and inhibit their ability to act. Because I think of people, military, who are on the front lines in war zones, humanitarian disasters, people who are saved, I think of the Bahamas and how many dead bodies that people would have seen. And so I'm curious how they respond and what training's available for someone like that.
Yeah, so the best thing that our Canadian Forces members, our EMS, our paramedics, our firefighters, our police officers have to their advantage is they really have a really deep fund of excellent training. So they're trained over and over again to respond to these critical life-saving situations, and they get very good at it. However, there's kind of a unusual kind of artifact that goes with being really exceptionally trained in something that very few people in the world get very trained at, is that, in fact, they're exposed to a much sheer higher number and volume of people who are in extreme distress, who may be not able to defend themselves or not able to advocate for themselves if they're medically compromised, if they're a victim of violent crime. And the police officer is now responding to that individual, providing support, reasserting safety for that individual. It's very easy for them to be taken by the fact that they're seeing people at the depths of their suffering who they, within their own role, can help reestablish safety and predictability, but they probably have a harder time dealing with the actual events that were violent or traumatic in some way, shape, or form. So the playing field or the context is much more fertile for a first responder or a military member to be affected, because they probably see things that most people in society don't.
Yeah.
And despite having really superior training in that, their humanity, their compassion, their empathy starts to second guess and rethink our predictable patterns of society. And so again, with first responders, folks in really good recovery get good at establishing their own factors of stability, of knowing the limits on what they can do when they lend aid, or support to individuals if there's a medical emergency, that there are limits on the human factor on what we can actually do.
Yeah.
And again, that's a big aspect of recovery, that we can dwell on those things that were very dramatic, very unusual, and we can really disregard the many, many other times that we went to work, we helped other people in a very meaningful way, but we focus on those things that it didn't go well. And that's something that we can really sort out in psychological treatment, so that people feel empowered to recognize that they are making a difference, but just like the people they defend and protect, they can be affected as well.
Yeah, and if they're not well, they can't do their job well. So
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the reality. So if I'm watching this and I want to find resources or advice, where would you recommend they start?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because sometimes the symptoms may not, one may not be aware of where these symptoms are coming from, right? So as a first responder in particular, if you're dealing with a lot of crime and you've done it for several years, you may not be able to definitively put your thumb on the reason why all of a sudden you're not sleeping well or eating well or recreating well. And that may take a bit of self-discovery and introspection to figure out perhaps there are some trends in your work world that promoted these symptoms. So good, reliable sources of information, which are usually people who know you well, can go a long way. And I mean, in our clinic, we get referrals from spouses saying, hey, there's something wrong with my husband, or there's something wrong with my wife, because they've spent a lot of time knowing that person well, and they know that there are some changes in their functional roles as a parent, as a spouse, etc., that are unusual. And once there is some awareness that there's been some changes and some demonstration of symptoms, then usually if they persist beyond a predictable time, which is usually a couple of weeks, and it starts to affect other important roles in our life, it may be a good idea to reach out to one's family doctor. If the family doctor has some comfort and literacy with post-traumatic stress disorder. If not, they're very well poised to refer to another mental health professional, whether it's a psychiatrist, psychologist, an evidence-informed clinician, who can sit down with that person, do some diagnostic clinical interviewing, and see if it is more than some regular symptoms associated with general distress, or if it's something more focally tied to the work or experiences they've gone through. But a family doc is a great first frontline resource. But then again, other crisis centers, there are other trauma centers out there, Canadian Mental Health Association, other crisis lines that people phone. All of those folks are very well trained and versed on helping people who've experienced an acute traumatic event.
And I think the important thing is too, I mean, first of all, is the awareness that it could be something you're experiencing, because I think most people would feel it's something they either just want to ignore, or it's a weakness, that they should be better by now. But I just look at sometimes the magnitude of the trauma, and it's kind of unrealistic to think you'd be normal by now.
Yeah, that's very well said, Leanne. I mean, there's a lot of public misconceptions out there, a lot of stigmatization and even self-stigma, that pejoratively people think that because now they have a disorder of caring, that represents that they might be weak, or they did themselves something wrong, that they can't shake it off and get back to their role. That's really nonsense. We know that it is, in the short term, it's very adaptive. Our central nervous system is saying, look, we're going to remind you how dangerous your work role is, or the natural disaster, or whatever the traumatic adversity is. And beyond that, if you continue to engender those symptoms, it's something that you're probably going to have to work out with some professional help, because it is now a full-blown medical condition.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. So in closing, is there anything maybe that I didn't ask you that you wanted to comment on before we close?
Yeah, I mean, there's more and more public awareness. There's much more awareness amongst employers of all sectors out there that people can be affected by traumatic adversity. Even WSIB, Workplace Safety Insurance Board, has changed the legislation about 3.5 years ago to reflect that first responders, police, fire, EMS professionals are much more likely, by the sheer volume of the encounters they have with traumatic adversity, to start to engender symptoms, that they are covered, that they get the help. It is a workplace injury, just as a slip and fall or concussion is, that needs mental health and professional support to recover. And those who do take advantage of increasing levels of community support and mental health assistance in the community recover, and they get back to work, and they feel engaged, and they feel vital again, which is a wonderful shift in the public misperceptions that go with mental health and mental illness for so long now.
Well, thank you so much. Hopefully somebody watching maybe will think, oh boy, there's hope out there for me. There's resources available, and that I can get through this. There is another side to it. So thank you, Charles, for taking the time to share your expertise today, and best of luck.
That's my hope as well, Leanne. Thanks for your time.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.